Hello and welcome to, Wednesday's edition of Alaska Weather, the 5th day of October 2022. I'm David Percy. Up first, we've got hazardous weather graphic, and red shaded areas are primarily high wind warnings, St. Lawrence Island, Bering Strait coast, Kotzebue Sound in toward the Selawik Valley, or just to the west there, Noatak Valley, western central Arctic coast, western north slope. That's for winds gusting to 65 miles an hour, and that's out for tonight and through tomorrow. And then the yellow shaded area there along the coast, that's a coastal flood advisory for possible beach erosion, high surf, southern coast of the Seward Peninsula, all of Norton Sound actually along the coastline there in the Yukon Delta coast. And actually there are coastal flood warnings out for the coastal areas there in the high wind warning areas, again tonight through tomorrow night and actually into early Friday for like the western Arctic coast and the northwest coast. And then inland there along the Alaska range, that's a wind advisory that's out for tonight and tomorrow for the Alaska range for winds gusting to 65 miles per hour through the Alaska range passes. And from there, moving on to satellite imagery, you can see a band of moisture moving east and northeast across the northeast part of the state, brought warmer air all the way up to the Arctic coast today. Temperatures in the 30s to near 40, some cases lower 40s there in advance of that with the southwest winds. And up to 1/10 of an inch of rain fell across most of the area up there, at least had some light precipitation. And then clouds moving in brought some showers into Cook Inlet today. Anchorage International Airport picked up 0.02 of an inch with some showers earlier today, followed by some clearing periods, clouds into the Copper River Basin, but very light precipitation associated with this. Still reporting some rain in Cordova. And then weak front brought some rain into the southern southeast coast. Another band kind of keeping it some light precipitation on the north coast there. And otherwise, Kodiak Island, right on the eastern edge, at least the state airport there, on the western edge of the moisture that's mostly off to the east. Some pretty good clearing across the southwest interior from actually the southwest coast all the way up along the Yukon River into the Kuskokwim Valley there, with partly to mostly sunny skies. Next system pushing across the northern Bering Sea, kicking wind and rain up St. Lawrence Island into the Bering Strait coast, as well as the northwest coast, north of Kivalina, Point Hope, Cape Lisburne, seeing some pretty good wind gusts, 40 to 50 miles an hour in that area there down towards St. Lawrence Island. Even stronger gusts back there over the Russian Far East, closer to the main front. And then just a lot of disorganized clouds over the Aleutians with light wind conditions. Very weak trailing edge there dragging across Shiminat, a little bit of moisture, but no significant winds at all over the southern Bering Sea with this. On the chart, you can see the tight gradient there creeping in towards St. Lawrence Island and the Bering Strait coast, as well as the northwest coast. And again, winds so far peak gusts of anywhere from 40 to 52 miles per hour there, strongest over St. Lawrence Island, and about 46 miles an hour at Tin City. Otherwise, that trough bringing some shower activity to the eastern Arctic coast North Slope areas, improving back to the west with partly mostly sunny skies there along the Yukon River Valley, all the way down to the southwest coast. Kuskokwim Valley looking pretty good as well. As portions of the interior there, more clouds over the Tanana Valley into the Copper River Basin, and some light rain amounts, although Ketchikan picked up 0.4 of an inch. Precipitation was kind of varied and variable across the Panhandle. Juneau only picking up 0.02 of an inch. And Kodiak had a 12-hour amount today of 1.16 inches. By contrast, only 1/100th of an inch fell at Seward. And out to the west there, or for tonight, we'll see that front weakens as it moves in, although the pretty tight gradient around the main low center near Wrangell Island, 958 millibar low, keeps the high wind warnings going, and again the coastal flood warnings kick into effect there for the northwest coast, Bering Strait coast areas, eventually the western Arctic coast, with again winds gusting as high as 65 miles an hour, winds on the increase through the eastern Alaska Range passes there with a tightening gradient. Otherwise, just some scattered shower activity, mostly along the central and western Alaska Range, maybe some light rain continuing at times in along the North Gulf Coast, but cutting off over toward Yakutat, high pressure, dry conditions for the Panhandle as the remnants of that moisture just fades away, and a few lingering showers over Kodiak Island. And for Thursday, still windy up there to the northwest, gradually diminishing though for the Bering Strait, St. Lawrence Island, but high wind warnings, coastal flood warnings continue for the northwest coast, western Arctic coast, and otherwise, periods of rain and winds not too bad at all over the interior, except through the eastern Alaska Range passes. Scattered showers, western Prince William Sound, maybe the southern Kenai Peninsula. Otherwise, basically dry and sunny for the Panhandle. And the outlook for Friday, improving over the northwest part of the state, western Arctic coast. Still a chance of moisture there. And cloudy with some rain or snow showers, depending on the elevation. Under 2,000 feet, it'll be in the form of rain there for south central Alaska, mostly sunny for the Panhandle. And for the lows tonight, 40s to lower 50s for the southeast coast, otherwise 30s and 40s, the remainder of the state. Highs mostly in the 50s everywhere except Klawock, pushing near 70 degrees, Prince of Wales Island. Lows, 40s to near 50 for the Panhandle, in the 40s elsewhere, and then highs, upper 40s to mid 50s. And again, mid-60s southern southeast coast. Up to the north, 20s and 30s for the lows tonight. Some areas a little warmer. Highs tomorrow, 40s to mid-50s around the greater Fairbanks area. And lows in the 30s, maybe some upper 20s in higher elevations of the Brooks Range. Followed by highs, 30s for the Arctic coast, North Slope, Brooks Range. 40s to near 50 south of the mountains. Out to the west, lows in the 40s. Highs in the 40s to mid-50s, warmest over the Alaska Peninsula, followed by lows in the upper 30s, and then highs Friday afternoon, 40s to lower 50s.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
On to flying weather. Looks like pretty good VFR over the North Slope with some IFR around the western Arctic coast here, Wainwright, and a little bit to the east. IFR along and south of the Brooks Range. Back to VFR, Yukon River, Kuskokwim River valleys, and Bristol Bay. Some IFR along the Alaska Range with VFR, Kenai Peninsula, up to northern Cook Inlet, Susitna Valley. IFR, western Prince William Sound, and into the southern Copper River Basin, over toward Yakutat, much of the Panhandle in the IFR zone. Narrow band of IFR with that weakening front there from the Seward Peninsula down across Nunivak Island, the Pribilofs, kind of expanding there from about Nikolsky to Amchitka Island. And for the afternoon, IFR from the southwest coast there, right down into the Unmak Island area, westward to Amchitka, and a little bit up into the Kuskokwim Valley as well. Marginal VFR now along the Yukon River Valley into the flats. IFR persisting along and south of the Brooks Range. VFR for the North Slope and Arctic coast. IFR Prince William Sound to Resurrection Bay, eastward about Cape St. Elias. And not much change. Still some IFR there along the western Alaska Range. Becoming VFR for the southeast coast. IFR east side of Kodiak Island. And for Friday morning, a lot of IFR now covering Kodiak Island into southern Cook Inlet, Prince William Sound, and up along the central and western Alaska Range. Also some IFR still on the south side of the Brooks Range there into the northern portions of the northern valleys, right on down to the southwest into Togiak Bay, Dillingham, Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians. And mostly VFR for the Panhandle, probably some IFR due to low clouds and fog there, as you can see in the south. And then for the afternoon Friday, VFR for the southeast coast up to Yakutat, VFR for much of interior Alaska, some marginal VFR with a weak system there along the western Arctic coast, and possible areas of marginal VFR, Bristol Bay, up along the Alaska Range into the Copper River Basin, North Gulf Coast, otherwise IFR for the Alaska Peninsula, and from Kiska Island to Atka. Passes, Anatuvik, IFR tomorrow, mostly IFR for Adigan as well. Lake Clark and Merrill, IFR especially on the eastern entrance of both passes. Call it marginal for rainy for the day on Thursday. Windy, IFR southern entrance, better out the north side. And for Isabel, marginal VFR at times. And for Mentasta, VFR for the entire day. Tanita, occasional marginal VFR possible throughout the entire day tomorrow, kind of right on the edge of things there. And for Portage, marginal VFR, but likely some IFR, especially early on for the eastern entrance. And Chilcoot and White becoming VFR. Freezing levels, a lot of lines across the state here. Up to 14,000 feet over the central and western Aleutians, 10,000 feet right into the southwest interior, 2,000 feet back up along the Arctic coast there, and then a little cooler, 6 to 8,000 feet there along the Alaska Range on down to the North Gulf Coast, and 8 to 10,000 feet over the Panhandle. Icing, not too bad. Couple of bands of isolated moderate rime icing, mostly there along the Yukon River north and northeast of the eastern Arctic coast. And then a smaller, weaker zone there along the western Arctic coast into the Bering Strait, just approaching St. Lawrence Island. And the jet stream, strong westerly flow across the Bering up to 170 knots there, kind of splits as it approaches the southwest coast, with one weaker branch diving off to the southeast around that low well south of Kodiak. Stronger branch, southwesterlies, turning south-southwest 120 knots there over the north slope, 90 knot southwest winds over the Yukon. And for 9,000 feet, high pressure over the Panhandle, southwest winds 45 to 75 knots in the interior, otherwise westerlies 40 to 45 over the southern Bering Sea and Aleutians. And at 3,000 feet, southwest winds 50 knots near the Kuskokwim Valley, Kuskokwim Mountain areas, and 40 knots into the Koyukuk Valley. Otherwise light over the Aleutians, and 60 knot westerly winds entering the Chukchi Sea area as well, and then maybe 50 knots there for the eastern Arctic coast, but light winds under high pressure for the Panhandle and the southeast interior areas. Turbulence-wise, pretty good zone here of considerable moderate chop, especially for small aircraft. Brooks Range, much of the central interior, western Alaska Range, down into Bristol Bay, Fognak Island, Cook Inlet areas.
Some places on the surface you might have these steep cracks and giant fissures that you would have to be careful not to fall into. In other places you might see towers of ice right next to places that were relatively smooth. You might see places that were dark. Ice there takes the form of rock. It's frozen solid until you dig down into that ocean. So you may see some things that look similar to Earth, but you may see some things that are very different.
That voice you just heard?
I am Morgan Kramer, NASA scientist.
I love it.
That's Morgan. She's probably one of NASA's best spokespeople for exploring our solar system's icy moons.
Europa is a fascinating place. It has this liquid water ocean that's about 3 times the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined. That's a lot of water.
To understand what makes Earth so special, sometimes you need to back up and take in the big picture. Remember, the cryosphere is every place on Earth with frozen water. And water is one of the biggest indicators for life.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it.
And so far, Earth is the only planet we know of with life. Although Europa isn't the only icy moon in our solar system, NASA has identified it as one of those places with key astrobiological potential. Morgan is a collaborator on the Mapping Imaging Spectrometer for Europa, an instrument selected for NASA's next mission to Jupiter's icy moon Europa. But she's also more than just a scientist working in a laboratory. She's preparing future NASA missions for success on the surface of alien worlds. This year, Morgan and her colleagues were in the field studying how life colonizes in fresh lava.
Earth, it turns out, has a lot of excellent, what we call analog environments, places that are similar enough to some of these other worlds, that we can conduct some tests and we can do some analyses here. Now, they're not perfect, of course. They're not going to be exactly like Europa, but we can still learn a lot by testing in these environments. Some of these places include Antarctica and the Arctic Circle, but there are other places too, Alaska, Greenland, even Iceland. Any place where you have a lot of ice, because guess what the surface of Europa is made of? A lot of ice.
Studying the cryosphere doesn't just have big implications for Earth. It also matters for the frozen worlds in our own cosmic backyard.
If we're able to find life or evidence of past life on a place like Europa, that tells us that not only can life happen in other places, but it's common enough that it happened at least twice in the same tiny solar system. That means that the universe is wide open in terms of how much life we might find, the types of life we might find. It would revolutionize how we see ourselves and the possibilities for contact in the universe. It would be amazing. Oh, it's so exciting.
As it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. So it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving. My interest in glaciers comes from the sheer size of these things and how much they're able to change on human timescales. And so the amount of mass and energy being transferred by glaciers around the globe is tremendous. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to study from space.
Mountain glaciers are some of the most charismatic parts of the cryosphere. Some might cling to the edges of cliffs at higher elevations, then lay bare and flat in a broad plain, looking cracked and weathered like elephant skin, before tumbling thousands of feet toward the sea and terminating in a dramatic calving front. They're like motion frozen in time, until they aren't. They tell a story about the distant past and yet are incredibly responsive to the present. You can understand why they'd be captivating to all of us, and especially cryospheric scientists. Meet Alex Gardner, a cryospheric scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who is going to help break down what a classic West Coast North American glacier might look like, where high amounts of snow dump onto the mountains.
And at higher elevations, there's melt in summer, but not enough melt to get rid of all of that snow. And so that snow accumulates, it compacts, it turns into ice, and it starts to flow under its own weight, and it flows down the valleys. And as it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out and down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving.
Alex uses satellite data to study large-scale changes in glacial ice. But 2,000 miles to the north, Chris Larson from the University of Alaska Fairbanks spends a lot of time studying glaciers from the air. He's been flying over Alaskan mountain glaciers for many years, most recently on a NASA-funded mission called Operation Icebridge Alaska. He's absolutely enamored with his local rivers of ice.
And what do you love about mountain glaciers?
Well, they're in mountains, so they're really pretty.
You couldn't ask for a better way to experience Alaska on a large scale than to go flying around for campaign after campaign and look at all of the mountains in Alaska. Truly infinite. You just feel like you'll never see the end of them and don't want to either.
But Chris doesn't spend weeks away from home and family for the views. Chris and his colleagues at NASA want to answer some pretty big questions by learning more about Alaskan glaciers and how they tick.
You know, why does NASA care about these? Well, they actually disproportionately contribute a large amount to sea level rise.
In the long run, as the Earth warms due to climate change, the big ice sheets and mighty outlet glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica stand to contribute the most to sea level rise, simply because the vast majority of the planet's ice is stored there. But currently, it's the world's smaller mountain glaciers in comparatively warmer places, like Alaska and Patagonia, that are contributing about a third of all inputs to sea level rise, even though they account for only 1% of the world's ice.
Mostly due to them being dynamic. They have water at the bed, which allows them to slide fast, and they react quickly to climate change and have higher velocities than their polar counterparts.
Back at JPL, Alex uses satellite measurements of global ice and computer models to predict ultimately how much sea level rise we might see due to climate change. But in the case of mountain glaciers, we also care about the local impacts of disappearing ice.
When we think of changes in ice sheets, we typically think of just what is the consequence for sea level rise and the future evolution of the ice sheets. But glaciers in other regions, like high mountain Asia, Alaska, the European Alps, these are places where changes in runoff matters to stream flows. In places like high mountain Asia, you have a lot of glaciers that feed the streams that flow down to populated regions. And that runoff becomes significant for water resources, irrigation, and agriculture.
Both Alex and Chris are passionate about understanding how glaciers are changing and what it means for our planet's future. They'll continue to use tools like elevation maps from the ICESat-2 satellite and detailed airborne measurements to monitor changing ice.
By the end of the tunnel, you're about 100 feet underground, and you're surrounded by bones sticking out of the wall from the steppe bison and the mastodons. There's sticks that are 40,000 years old. There's grass that's still green, that's tens of thousands of years old.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Coastal water forecast. Not too bad along the southeast coast tomorrow. South coast, east winds at 10 knots. East-northeast winds at 10 knots. Seas running 7 to 8 feet. East to northeast winds on the north coast at 10 knots. Northern interchannel, south winds 15 knots. Otherwise, central Stevens Passage, northwest winds at 10 knots. Clarence Strait, northwest winds 15 knots. And for the day on Friday, on the south coast, north to northwest winds at 15 knots. Central coast, northwest 15, and the north coast, southeast 20 to 25 knots. Over the inside waters, variable winds at 10 knots with slight seas. Prince William Sound, southeast winds 15 knots, seas 3 feet. North Gulf Coast, winds southeast 15 knots, seas 8 to 9 feet. And for the Barren Islands, southeast winds at 20 knots. Small craft advisories, Kamishak Bay, southeast winds 20 knots. Cook Inlet, south to southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. And for Friday, Cook Inlet, south winds 20 knots. Kamishak Bay and the Barren Islands, also south winds at 20 knots. For the North Gulf Coast, southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Prince William Sound, small craft advisories, east winds 25 knots, seas 4 feet. Kodiak Island, variable to southeast winds on Thursday at 10 to 15 knots. And for the Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula, south winds 15 knots. Pacific side, variable winds at 10 knots. And Bristol Bay looking at south winds at 20 knots, but seas only at 2 feet. For Friday, Alaska Peninsula, variable to west winds at 10 to 15 knots, seas 5 feet. Southwest winds 15 knots for Bristol Bay with 4-foot seas. Kodiak Island, west to south winds 15 to 20 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, variable to south winds at 10 to 15 knots for the day Thursday, with seas running 3 to 6 feet. Light variable winds for the central Aleutians, and for the western Aleutians, west winds at 20 knots with 8-foot seas. For Friday, western Aleutians, west winds at 15 knots. Otherwise, central Aleutians, north winds 15 knots, and variable to northwest winds 10 to 15 knots for the Fox Islands, with seas running 3 to 5 feet. And for the Pribilof Islands on Thursday, north winds 15 knots. Small craft advisories for St. Matthew Island, southwest winds 30 knots. St. Lawrence Island, southwest winds 30 knots. And for the southwest coast, west-southwest winds at 20 knots with 6 to 8 foot seas. And Norton Sound, small craft advisories, southwest winds 25 knots, seas 6 feet. And for Friday, Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, southwest winds 30 knots with 6 to 10 foot seas. Yukon Delta Coast, small craft advisory, southwest winds 25 knots. And for the St. Matthew Island area, west winds at 25 knots. Pribilof Islands and the Kuskokwim Delta coastline, west winds at 20 knots. From Wales to Cape Thompson for Thursday, gale warnings. Southwest winds 40 knots, 15 foot seas. Storm warnings for the western Arctic coast, southwest winds 50 knots with 20 foot seas. Central Arctic coast, south winds 40 knots, seas 17 feet. And then winds diminished to southeast 20 knots over toward Kaktovik, Barter Island to Demarcation Point. And for Friday, gale warnings from Cape Thompson all the way up to the Central Arctic coast, southwest winds 35 to 40 knots. Even a portion of the eastern Arctic coast, winds will be southwest at 35 knots with seas near 10 feet. Otherwise, from Wales to Cape Thompson, southwest winds 30 knots with 11 foot seas. And for tonight, that strong front and intense low center near Wrangel Island, producing high wind warnings, St. Lawrence Island, Bering Strait coast, with coastal flood warnings for the northwest coast. High wind warnings extend into the western North Slope, Brooks Range to the central Arctic coast for winds gusting to 65 miles an hour. Much lighter winds on the southern portion of that front, with much lighter precipitation as well. Stays nice over the interior, eastern interior, showers along the Alaska Range, some light rain on the North Gulf Coast. For tomorrow, mostly sunny for the Panhandle and southeast interior. Weakening front spread some rain inland, extending to the eastern Arctic coast. Winds stays quite windy over the Chukchi Sea, northwest central Arctic coast, but light winds over the southern Bering Sea and the Aleutians. And for Friday, look for another weak front to keep some light rain on the North Gulf Coast and over much of southern Alaska. Lighter amounts of precipitation along the west coast. Sunny over the
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.